One afternoon in June of 1993, a movie director named Xie Jin sat on a couch in a production studio in the city of Yinchuan, China. He was with a few members of his production team, and they were in the middle of auditioning what felt like the 100th terrible actor for the lead role in the film that he was directing. However, this was not an ordinary lead role. The lead role for this film was going to be a dog. So the movie was called An Old Man and His Dog, and it was based on this popular novel about a man living during a period of war in China with his loyal yellow dog. People had really responded to the story in the book because it captured just how devastating war could really be on rural communities, and a lot of people in China had seen themselves in the characters in this story. At this point, Jin had already cast the film's human actors, but the dog's role was by far the hardest to fill, and obviously the most central to the movie. He and his team had hosted a bunch of casting calls already and advertised to the public to ask if anybody had a dog that looked like the one that was in this book. And tons of people had answered this ad, but none of the dogs that they brought in were good enough for the film. And the reason for that is Jin knew, the dog needed to look the part, but it was more than that. Like, the dog also had to be compelling and charismatic despite being a dog. I mean, this dog was the hero of the story and the soul of the movie. So it really had to project loyalty and bravery and goodness on screen and sort of come across also as gentle and sweet enough that audiences fell in love with it. But now, as Jin watched yet another anxious, poorly trained dog actor scurry around the room, he felt this wave of anxiety. Jin was starting to feel worried that, maybe the reason all these dog actors were not working out is because maybe the perfect dog just didn't exist. And if that was true, then his movie would not be good. Like, he would have a bad actor in the lead role and it would flop. And for Jin, that really represented sort of like a worst case scenario for him. So decades earlier, in the 1950s, Jin had been this prolific director in China, and he had won many prestigious awards. But during China's Cultural Revolution, which was a period of unrest in the country in the 1960s and 70s, Jin had been ostracized by the public because of his largely unpopular political views. And ever since then, he had been struggling to regain his status as a celebrated filmmaker. And so the chance to adapt this brilliant novel, which was touching and tragic and already beloved by the public, was like his opportunity to prove himself and get back on top. And he knew that, if the movie failed, he was old enough that he would very likely not get another chance like this, and he might be completely forgotten about. And so now, as this dog's audition came to an end, and obviously this dog was not going to be a fit, Jin's just sitting there feeling kind of hopeless, and Jin's producer walked up and led the anxious dog and its owner out of the room, and Jin at this point was so busy worrying to himself about how this movie was destined to fail now that he barely noticed his producer bringing in the next dog and owner. But when Jin looked up, and he actually looked at the dog that was now standing in front of him, the 101st audition he was seeing that day, he just stopped and practically gasped, because sitting in front of him, right in the middle of the room, was now this new dog that looked exactly like how he had pictured the one from the book. It was shaggy and big and yellow-haired and had this eager-to-please look in its eyes that made Jin instantly feel like he was connected to it. The owner who had come in with this dog was a young, friendly guy in his 30s who introduced himself as Chung, and he explained that he had just started a dog training and breeding company. And so having his dog cast in this movie would be a really big deal for his new business and would definitely help get his name out there. So this was like high stakes for him too. Now, Jin did not love the fact that, Chung had just begun this dog training and breeding business, so it meant that very likely he was pretty inexperienced with this dog actor. However, when the actual audition began, any worries Jin might have had completely vanished. Throughout the entire audition, Chung skillfully directed this dog like he'd been doing it for his whole life. And the dog was obviously really smart and followed all the commands. He was, really well trained. And it just seemed like the dog was really devoted to Chung, because it really did exactly what Chung asked every single time. But more than that, as Jin watched this audition, it really felt like this dog didn't just look the part, it acted the part. This was the dog he wanted in his movie. And so after only a few minutes, Jin stopped the audition and he told Chung, You and your dog have got the job. They began filming the movie just a few days later, and basically as soon as they started, all the worries Jin had had about maybe this movie not doing so well just completely vanished. Because, just like he'd anticipated, this dog really was perfect. It obeyed his owner, Chung, without hesitation, same as it had during the audition. And the camera just loved this dog. The dog had this very sweet, tender quality to it that really came out anytime the actor playing the old man interacted with it, which is exactly what Jin had hoped for. And so Jin knew this dog was going to steal the hearts of everybody who saw it on screen. This was exactly what he wanted. And so Jin just disappeared into the making of this film. He poured all his focus, all his passion into each and every frame. And by the time production finally wrapped a few months later, Jin was sure they had just made a masterpiece. And Jin was right. The movie was released to rave reviews, and it seemed like everyone who saw it loved it. Not only was An Old Man and His Dog recognized as one of China's top films of the year, but also it was widely regarded as an instant classic worldwide. And so Jin knew that he had accomplished his goal here, and that his career now had a new beginning. A year and a half later, on an evening in late January of 1995, Jin was reading a script in his living room in the city of Shanghai, China. So the huge success of An Old Man and His Dog had meant that Jin was once again in very high demand, which meant he got lots of phone calls and people wanted him to read their scripts, and he was basically just getting to pick and choose what he wanted to do next. This was like best case scenario for him. So as Jin is sitting there, when his phone rang, because his phone again was ringing all the time these days, he assumed it had to be one of his producers who wanted to talk about one of the many scripts they were looking at. However, when Jin answered the phone, it was one of his producers, but what they said to him completely stunned Jin. His film, An Old Man and His Dog, apparently was being banned. Jin, when he heard this, he just sat there for a moment, unable to actually respond to this. This didn't make any sense. Why in the world would this wholesome movie about an old man and his dog get banned? This wasn't political in any way. This was a wholesome, family-friendly movie. So China did ban films with some regularity. Sometimes it was the content itself within the film could be viewed as being, unduly influential on the public in a negative way, and so that could cause the film to be banned. Or it could just be that the people who were in the film or the producers who made the film, they could have done something in their own personal lives that was viewed as being, unduly influential on the public, in a negative way. They could have had some scandal, and then because of that scandal, they could have their work banned. So the movie itself could be okay, but the people involved in the movie, they're bad, so movie must be bad as well. So that was sort of relatively normal. But Jin's film, An Old Man and His Dog, had been out for over a year at this point with no issues. It was viewed as this masterpiece. Everybody loved it. Everyone had all these great things to say about it. So it couldn't have been that. The movie itself clearly was okay. And Jin, he had in his former life, he had been politically divisive and it had cost him dearly, but that was in the past. He had not done anything political, not in this movie, not in his personal life now. He had not done anything that was scandalous that could potentially warrant, this film being banned. And so Jin's what in the world could have caused this movie to be banned? What is going on here? And his producer said, you're not going to believe it, but it's the dog. It would turn out, a few days before the producer called Jin, Chung, the owner of the dog who had starred in this film, had been arrested for being a serial killer. Over the last 5 years, he had murdered at least 5 people. But that was not actually why this movie was being scrutinized. The movie was being banned because of how Chung disposed of the bodies of the people he killed. After murdering and dismembering his victims, he would take those body parts and feed them to his dog, the star of the movie. And so ultimately, the Chinese government banned this film because they knew from now on, now that the news broke about Chung being a killer and what he did with the bodies, that you couldn't watch this movie and watch that dog without thinking about the fact that that dog was eating people. Jin would go on to make a few more movies, but they never really worked, and ultimately his career kind of stalled, and he never reached the heights that he had hoped for. However, Jin had always hoped that one day he would leave a truly lasting mark on the Chinese film industry. And he did, because he'll always be known for casting a flesh-eating dog in his cinematic masterpiece. One evening in December of 1966, an 8-year-old girl named Elaine Ellery hurried after her parents as they walked towards this large factory in Norfolk, England. Elaine was so excited about the night ahead here that she was literally skipping as she walked along. So this factory was where her father worked, and they were having their big annual Christmas party. And for the first time ever, Elaine was being allowed to go, and she couldn't wait to see what was inside. So Elaine was really close with her dad, because even though he worked very long hours, he always went out of his way to spend time with her and make her feel very special. In fact, during the work week, it wasn't uncommon for her dad to come home over his lunch break just to give his daughter a big hug, and so they could quickly eat together before he had to rush back to work. And so now, after hearing about her dad's amazing factory over countless lunches they spent together, Elaine, for the first time ever, was actually going to be able to see what he was talking about, because to this point, she had never even stepped foot inside of the factory. Finally, Elaine and her parents arrived in front of this big factory, and in the doors they went, and immediately Elaine is like totally struck by just how truly incredible this place is. I mean, it was huge inside. It was already packed with people who were chatting about. There were all these other coworkers and their kids and their families, and Christmas music was playing, and all she could smell was apple cider and baked goods. And she looked around and she saw the whole interior of this great entry room they had walked into was beautifully decorated for the holidays. There was tinsel and there were all these things hung up everywhere, and there was even fake snow all over the place to give it like a true Christmas vibe. And so Elaine, I mean, she had really high expectations of how grand this place was going to be, and so far, it had more than lived up to its expectations. I mean, this was really like an incredible thing. So she was delighted, and the whole night she just ran around the party holding her dad's hand, looking at the machines and meeting his coworkers and eating all these treats. I mean, it was really just an incredible time. I mean, the evening was a whirlwind for her, and before she knew it, Elaine was exhausted and back in the car, driving home, drifting off into a very happy sleep. The rest of Elaine's childhood was very charmed. I mean, basically, she and her dad stayed very close. You know, they went to that Christmas party every year after that first time she went, and it was always such a fun event. And Elaine and her dad continued to have those lunch breaks during the work week. And, you know, by the time Elaine was getting old enough to start thinking about, you know, starting a family of her own, she thought hard about the values that her father had instilled in her. One was her dad clearly worked very, very hard. And the second one was her father clearly prioritized family over everything else. You know, as inconvenient as it was for him to come home on his lunch break practically every day, you know, taking a break from, you know, backbreaking work in the factory, he still did it because he wanted his daughter to feel prioritized and special. And so she knew when she had a family of her own, she would act like her father. So you can imagine how Elaine felt in 1983 when Elaine was 25 years old, and by this point, she'd gotten married, she had 2 kids of her own, she was living up to the example her father had set for her. You can imagine how she felt when that year her father passed away. I mean, for Elaine, this was like earth-shattering. I mean, she knew he was getting older, and it wasn't wholly unexpected that he passed, but for Elaine, I mean, this truly was like devastating. I mean, her father was like her rock. She had really modeled her whole life on her dad. However, after that initial really intense grief period ended right after the death of her father, Elaine was able to, you know, have a moment of reflection, and she realized that, you know, as devastating as it was that he was gone now, you know, in a way, because of the way she had built her life, prioritizing family and, you know, living like her dad, that in some ways, even though he was gone physically, spiritually, he was very much still with her and always would be. Fast forward 41 years to one afternoon late in the summer of 2024. And Elaine, who was now in her late 60s, was sitting at her kitchen table in her Norfolk home reading the newspaper. So Elaine had retired just a few years ago. And so now her life was pretty much exclusively about her family and about, you know, slowing down and truly being retired. And in some ways, the timing couldn't have been better for her to start slowing down because Lately, Elaine had been feeling absolutely exhausted, which was odd because Elaine felt like, even though she viewed her retirement as a chance to slow down, that she would likely have more energy because she wasn't working anymore. And so her slowing down would sort of be by choice, not because she literally couldn't keep up anymore. But lately, it was like Elaine had zero energy. It's like all she could do was sit in place and either read or call her kids, and that was basically it. But on this particular day, as Elaine just sat in the kitchen reading the newspaper, despite not physically really doing much at all, she suddenly started to feel winded, like she had been running around or something, like it was hard to catch her breath, and it scared her. She put the paper down and she sat there for a minute trying to calm herself down, telling herself this is just like a panic attack or something. But it didn't go away, and she really was struggling to breathe. And so she decided she would get up and go get a cup of water and just, take a sip of water and calm down. But when she stood up and began walking over to the sink to get water, like this sensation she was having just got worse and worse. And by the time she was at the counter, she's like holding on to it just to stay up on her feet, and she's trying to sip the water, but she's still like unable to breathe. And she realized that this, combined with this recent really intense fatigue, meant something had to be wrong here. Like this was not something she could just write off. And so she hobbled her way over to the phone, she picked it up, and she called her doctor. Not long after, one of Elaine's children came by, picked her up, and drove her to the hospital. And by this point, Elaine, she'd calmed down a little bit, but still that experience of really not being able to breathe really had shaken her up. And so Elaine, she goes into the doctor's office and she sits down in the exam room and she explains to her doctor what's been going on and what just happened that day. And not long after that, her doctor got a series of tests done, and eventually Elaine got an answer from those tests that explained all of her symptoms. However, that answer made Elaine look at her childhood, her charmed childhood, in a completely new and disturbing way. It would turn out, decades earlier, Elaine's father really had been setting a great example by working very hard and always prioritizing his family and always prioritizing his daughter. But what her father didn't know at the time, in fact, many people didn't know at the time, was that his work itself was actually putting his family at risk. At this time in the UK, most factories, like the one Elaine's father worked at, made products that contained asbestos. So asbestos is a substance that was used very widely for decades to construct structures primarily. Like in construction, it was used a lot. In fact, it was so common that basically any house or building built before the year 2000 likely was made with asbestos inside of it. And so when Elaine was growing up in the 1960s, asbestos was, naturally still being used all the time, and her father obviously encountered it daily at his work. But even though they didn't know it at the time, this was a huge problem for Elaine and her family, and really for anybody else who was living a life that was similar to theirs. Because asbestos was eventually found to be highly toxic and known to cause a very specific type of very aggressive and very deadly cancer that can sometimes take decades to develop. It was the very kind of cancer that Elaine's father had died from in the 1980s. And unfortunately, it was the very kind of cancer that Elaine was diagnosed with in 2024 following that, difficulty breathing and fatigue spell. And then she would eventually die a year later in 2025 from that cancer. And so in a tragic twist of fate here, basically it was because of how close Elaine was with her father growing up that she ultimately contracted the same disease that he did. I mean, there's no question he got that cancer because of his exposure to asbestos in the factory. But he would come home from the factory, like over lunch, he'd come home and he'd have lunch with Elaine and he wouldn't change. He'd give her a big hug. They'd have their lunch break together. He's putting asbestos on his daughter, not knowingly, but he's covering her in this toxic substance. And then when he would bring her to the Christmas party, all that white snow on the ground was not snow, it was asbestos, but they didn't know it was toxic. And so ultimately, it really was because of how much she loved her dad and how much he loved her that ultimately killed them both. Around 9 p.m. on January 18, 2015, a 68-year-old man named Dennis Antiporak stood at his kitchen counter in North Miami Beach, Florida, writing a note. And this note was for his wife and for his adult daughter, Laura, who lived with them. And all he was doing was letting them know that he was going to be stepping out, but he'd be back in a couple of hours. Now, for Dennis, it actually was not that unusual for him to go out this late at night. This was kind of routine. He would often leave the condo where they lived, and he would go down the street to this diner called Denny's, which is a big chain in America. And he would hang out there with his friends, stay there for a couple of hours, and then he'd come back home. And tonight was going to be no different. His plan, as he said in this letter, was to go to Denny's. However, there was one stop he wanted to make before he headed out to Denny's, and he made that clear in his note. He basically provided his loved ones with his evening itinerary. So after finishing the note, Dennis left it on the counter, he grabbed his things, and then he walked out the front door of the condo. Several hours later, around 2 a.m., Dennis's daughter, Laura, paced around the living room of the family's condo with her cell phone to her ear. So she and her mother had gotten home around 10, so an hour after Dennis had left, and they had found Dennis's note on the kitchen island. But now, it was getting really late, and from the note, it seemed an awful lot like he would have been back by now. And so now Laura was trying to call her dad to figure out what was going on. However, every time Laura dialed her dad's number, it just went straight to voicemail. And so again, now that it's like 2 a.m. and she's starting to worry about her dad, she knew that he had gone to Denny's, the diner down the road, and so she looked up the number for that restaurant. It was open 24/7, and she called the Denny's. However, when a worker at Denny's answered the phone and Laura asked them, hey, is my dad there? Because by this point they would know him. He went there all the time. The worker said no, he hadn't been in at all the whole night. And so after hearing this, Laura was baffled. Like, where else could her dad be? But then she remembered the note, because her dad said before he was going to go to Denny's, he was going to make a pit stop. And so she looked at the note again, and she was like, that's where he has to be. He's got to be upstairs. So upstairs in this condo complex was a whole bunch of amenities that this place offered for its residents. There was a big gym and a pool, and there were common areas and relaxation rooms and all these different things up there. And Dennis loved going up there. And in his note, he indicated that's where he was going to go and go relax for a little bit before going out to Denny's. And so Laura, she heads upstairs, and the first place she looks is the gym. But the gym was totally empty. No one's up there working out at 2 in the morning. It was vacant, and her dad's nowhere to be found. And then from the gym, she went to the pool area, and the pool was closed, but she could look into the pool area itself. And there was no one in there, including her dad. He was not in the pool. But then Laura looked from the pool over to this door that was near the pool area that led to one of those relaxation rooms that this condo offered its residents. And in her dad's note, he had indicated he was going up there to, relax. And so she walked over to the door, she tried the handle, it was unlocked, she pushed it open, and immediately she was hit with this overwhelming smell. She nearly gagged, and then she looked up and she saw her dad. So this condo had a whole bunch of different ways for their residents to unwind and relax. They had these relaxation rooms. They had mindfulness rooms and meditation rooms and yoga rooms. They had the pool, they had the gym, and they had Dennis's favorite relaxation room, which was actually just a sauna. So earlier that night, Dennis went into the sauna, expecting to be in there for a short amount of time to just relax, basically. A sauna, all it is just a closed space that gets really, really hot inside, and you sweat, and you just kind of sit there and just allow your body to kind of melt a little bit and relax, and then you get out again, you feel very refreshed. But it's critical that you only stay in for a limited amount of time, because you're effectively inside of an oven. And Dennis, he went into the sauna, no one else is in there, he set the timer for when it should shut off, and he fell asleep inside the sauna. And then the timer malfunctioned, and so the sauna didn't turn off. And so he's asleep in the sauna, it's just cooking him over and over again until he actually has a heat-induced heart attack and he dies. But then nobody knew he was in there, and the sauna's still on, and so he's dead in the sauna, basically just cooking for hours and hours and hours, until finally his daughter Laura went up there, opened up the sauna door, and found her dad, who by this point was literally charbroiled. One hot afternoon in May of 1891, a 31-year-old businessman named James Hatcher rushed through the small town of Pikeville, Kentucky. And as he made his way, he could feel people staring at him because he knew he very likely looked crazy. His hair was totally wild, his suit that he had slept in the night before was all rumpled from sleeping in it, and he was swatting at all the flies that were buzzing around his head. Flies were very common in this part of Kentucky in the spring. But right now, James did not care what anybody thought, because his only focus at this very moment was just getting to the town doctor's office, because in his hand, he held this legal document that he was sure would put an end to the psychological torture he'd been enduring ever since his wife had died. So up until very recently, James had had sort of a charmed, perfect life. Even though he was a pretty young guy, he was still one of the richest men in town. He'd made his fortune in coal and real estate. And in fact, he actually owned most of Pikeville, where he was. But more than having lots of money and resources, the real thing that had made him so happy and really fulfilled his life was that he'd had this great marriage to his wife, Octavia. And last year, they had gotten pregnant with their first child, and it just seemed like everything was coming up roses. But then 4 months ago, tragedy had struck. Their baby had died just hours after being born, and it was arguably the worst thing that had ever happened to James or his wife. That is until just last week, when Octavia herself had died. The doctor had told James that his wife had died from a broken heart, from losing her child. It had just been so much, it had killed her. And during the chaos of making the arrangements for the funeral and just grappling with this overwhelming grief, not only for the loss of his child still, but now his wife as well. I mean, his life is wrecked here. James had not questioned the cause of death. He had just accepted it. But after the funeral, when James was back inside of his mansion, now all by himself because his family has been wiped out here, he found himself just like unable to live. I mean, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't go to work, he couldn't do anything. All he could do was just pace around the mansion by himself, just obsessing over how in the world this could have happened. How could he have lost his child and his wife, a week apart? How could that have happened? He had a perfect life. How could this be? And the more he obsessed over this unbelievable loss, the more he began to question specifically how his wife had died. Because again, he had been told by the doctor she had died of a broken heart, but he was thinking, wait a minute, I just don't buy that diagnosis. Like there's gotta be something else. Now, of course, it was true that Octavia was completely devastated after losing her baby. I mean, she and her husband both were devastated. But people did not die of sadness, not really. I mean, they can decline rapidly, but to literally die from a broken heart just seemed impossible. And so now the question of what really had killed his wife was all James could think about. It was like instead of just grieving the loss of his wife and his child, it was like he needed to solve what happened to his wife for real. And pretty quickly, James decided that the only real way to figure out what happened to his wife was not going and talking to the doctor again or reading literature, about various symptoms that could have been hers and try to tie it to some disease or something. No, he realized that the best thing he could do is just go dig his wife up and have a look. So James had convinced a local judge to order an emergency exhumation, to dig up his wife. And the judge had said yes, and he had given him a legal document saying he could do that. And so that legal document was what he was carrying as he hustled through town looking totally crazy on his way to the town doctor's office. Because it was ultimately the town doctor who would actually examine his wife's body once the exhumation was complete. And so James, he finally reaches the doctor's office and he bangs on the door, and eventually the doctor opened up, sort of looking at this guy who, again, looks totally wild, frumpled suit, hair crazy, flies everywhere. And he's like, hey, what's going on? And James, he just hands over this legal document, the order that says he's gonna exhume his wife. And the doctor took the order and he read it, and he kind of looked up at James with almost like a look of sympathy on his face. Like he felt bad for James. Like obviously this man's life has just fallen to shambles here. Now, the doctor was clearly prepared to fulfill this order and to look at his wife's body, but he made a point of telling James that, digging up Octavia now just was not a good idea. It wouldn't change what happened, and it definitely would not bring her back. Like this is not the move here. But James knew all this, and he really didn't care about anything the doctor was saying because he wasn't trying to bring his wife back. He just wanted to know the truth. He had to. And so, later that afternoon, James and the doctor stood by Octavia's tombstone as a pair of cemetery workers dug up her grave. And it was so hot outside that James and the doctor were sweating profusely, and these flies are everywhere. I mean, it's kind of a miserable scene here. But James, he was just kind of overcome by this sense of almost dread. Like, he definitely wanted to do this, but he's realizing that any moment here, after these guys dig up this grave, that he's going to physically see his wife again, his dead wife. And he didn't really know how he was going to feel, like literally seeing her in the condition that she was going to be in, decomposed. But he knew this was the right thing to do. So he just sat there, swatting at flies, sweating profusely, just waiting. And eventually, one of the workers with their shovel, they dug into the ground and it struck something hard. It was the coffin. And so at that point, James and the doctor, they kind of leaned into the hole to look down, and one of the workers got to the side and lifted up the lid of the coffin, and inside was Octavia. But Octavia was not in the same position she had been in when she was lowered into the ground. She was sort of in this position with her hands up, and across the top, the inside top of the actual coffin, were all these deep gouges, like scratch marks on the inside of the coffin, and Octavia's nails were all flipped backwards. So shortly after James buried his wife, he's totally heartbroken. He's questioning, the doctor's diagnosis of what actually killed her. And in that period of time, over those few days after the funeral, there were several people in Pikeville that came down with a mysterious illness. They almost appeared to be dead, but it would turn out it was just from being bit by these flies that were swarming around everybody this spring. And so James, as he's thinking about his wife and what really killed her, he began to have this panicked thought that maybe his wife hadn't died at all. Forget the broken heart thing. Maybe she had just been bit by a fly and appeared to be dead, and now I've buried her. And so he had to get her up, exhume her, and check. And when he opened up the coffin, he saw he was right. She had not died of a broken heart. She clearly had been bit by a fly. She woke up underground in her coffin and slowly asphyxiated while trying to burrow her way back out again. Shortly after James had buried his wife in the ground, like in those subsequent few days, he noticed several people in Pikeville, where he lived, had come down with something they called sleeping sickness, which is something you get from being bit by one of those flies that are always buzzing around these folks' heads in this town in the spring. And, sleeping sickness sometimes can take the form of just having like a fever and being very achy. But in some cases, really bad sleeping sickness can cause people to drift into a coma for several days. Sometimes they wake up, but sometimes they don't. They die. Or others, like the sleeping sickness is so severe that it causes their heart rate to drop so low that they're not in a coma, but they almost give the impression of being dead. And so sleeping sickness basically mimics death and sometimes causes death, but some people do come out of it. And so James, he's seeing all these people have this illness, and he began to wonder, well, wait a minute, I'm already questioning my wife's diagnosis. What if something even worse happened? What if she wasn't even dead? What if she had just gotten bit by one of those flies and had sleeping sickness? And so in a panic, he has her exhumed, and when he opens the coffin, what does he see? All the signs in the world that his wife had not been dead, so she did not die of a broken heart. No, she was alive when she was buried, and at some point she woke up, but she was trapped, and she slowly asphyxiated while trying to claw her way out. She must have been bit by a fly and got sleeping sickness. One morning in early 2020, a 24-year-old woman named Rosa Sanchez laid in a hospital bed inside of a national medical center in Lima, Peru. And while she lay in her bed, Rosa was sort of vaguely aware of doctors and nurses and a small group of strangers sort of leering over her, staring at her like she was some kind of medical anomaly. But Rosa really couldn't pay attention to anyone right now, because right now, she was feeling sicker than she ever had felt in her whole life. Her stomach hurt so much that it felt like she was rotting from the inside out or something. And at the same time she was having this awful physical symptom, she was also feeling incredibly depressed and overwhelmed with guilt. So just a few months ago, Rosa had been a happy, successful college student working towards a degree in economics. But then there had been this this outbreak, this sudden disease outbreak at her school, and a bunch of students, including Rosa, had gotten sick with some kind of mysterious illness that still had not been identified. And Rosa had gotten so sick, she actually had to temporarily drop out of school and move back home with her mother and father and 2 little siblings. And it was at that time that something truly just tragic and unimaginable happened. Rosa, when she came home, was still sick, and she wound up infecting her entire family, all 4 of them, and within weeks, they all died. Rosa's still alive, but her family is now wiped out from this disease that she still had. And so Rosa now is not only dealing with this horrific illness that feels like it's killing her, but she's living with the reality that, in her mind, she caused the deaths of her whole family. And so this is just like the worst possible scenario anybody could be in. And so now in the hospital, Rosa, who's sort of just totally out of it, she's racked with pain in her stomach. She could tell that a doctor had actually moved up right next to her bedside, and he began telling her some of the results from the recent diagnostic testing they had been running on her. And the doctor told her that, they had run all these blood work tests and they'd done these imaging scans, but so far everything had come back normal. And so they still didn't know what was wrong with her. However, the doctor did say that he wanted to try a different kind of test that might be able to tell them a little bit more. He explained that since Rosa's basic imaging scans had come back normal, what he wanted to do now was try a more advanced type of imaging known as a SPECT scan. Before she could even ask what a SPECT scan was, he explained to her that what it would be is she would be injected with this radioactive substance, and then after that, they would have her lie down inside of this machine that could basically trace the substance as it moved through her body. Basically, this would allow doctors to not just look at Rosa's internal organs, but to actually see how they were functioning in real time. Hearing this, Rosa couldn't help but be a little weary of the idea of a radioactive substance being injected into her body. But at the same time, her life is in shambles. She basically knows this disease is probably going to kill her at some point, and so she was desperate enough to try anything. So she closed her eyes and just nodded yes, she would try this new scan. About an hour later, Rosa was laying on this long, thin platform right outside of the SPECT scan machine, which was like this big machine that was shaped kind of like a donut with an opening large enough for her to be basically slid in through horizontally. By this point, Rosa had already been injected with this radioactive substance. And now the same doctor who had suggested this scan in the first place stood right beside her and told her that the actual scan would only take maybe 30 minutes when she was inside of this machine. And all she would have to do during the scan was just lie perfectly still. So Rosa said okay, and then she heard the doctor leave the room. A moment later, the SPECT machine began making a whirring sound, at which point the platform that Rosa was laying on began moving, and she was brought inside of this machine, inside of the donut, and then eventually the platform stopped, and at that point she's just looking at the inside of this machine, which was just, white plastic all around her. And for a couple of minutes, as this scan began and Rose is just laying there, being as still as possible, everything seemed fine. She had never done a SPECT scan before. But then, out of nowhere, pain ripped through Rose's abdomen, which was already in pain, but this was a new pain. It was so severe. Like, she knew she was supposed to stay still, but she couldn't help but sort of lean forward from how much pain was in her gut. And then as she's telling herself to stay calm, she began feeling lightheaded, and she had tunnel vision, and she began to panic. She's claustrophobic. And then before long, her ears were ringing. And then it was like everything just kind of faded, her vision went black, and Rosa died. And so the doctor, he's outside of the room, and he's hearing and seeing in real time Rosa basically dying. And so as fast as he can, he shuts off the SPECT machine, which immediately causes the platform that she is on to automatically go back out of the machine. And so as the doctor runs into the room, he sees Rosa just lying there on this platform, outside of the machine, and she's completely limp, like she's lifeless. But the doctor was thinking the scan had actually worked. It told him exactly what was wrong with Rosa. What the scan had shown the doctor before Rosa died was that Rosa had severely low blood flow to several crucial areas of her brain. And this lack of blood flow was what had actually caused all of her symptoms. But this was actually really good news, because now the doctor simply leaned over Rosa, looked into her wide open eyes, and told her to please just go ahead and sit up, because Rosa was not dead. She just thought she was. It would turn out Rosa was suffering from two extremely rare psychological disorders. The first was known as Cotard syndrome, and it caused Rosa to believe that she was literally rotting from the inside out, and then eventually that she died. She literally believed that she had died inside of the scanner. And the second rare psychological disorder was Capgras syndrome. It had caused Rosa to think that many of the people close to her, like her classmates and her own family members, had gotten sick and died from this mystery illness. And then they had been replaced by clones. The reality here was that there actually was never any disease outbreak at Rosa's school or in her home. The group of strangers in Rosa's hospital room were her mother, father, and two siblings. They were perfectly fine. As for Rosa herself, she was obviously mentally very unwell, but physically, she was never sick at all. Now, Rosa would need continued psychiatric care, but after 3 weeks in the hospital, she was able to go home with the family that she believed she had lost forever. In the spring of 1988, a 27-year-old woman named Severina stood in the corner of a small adobe house in the rural village where she lived in the mountains of Bolivia. The house belonged to a curandero, which was a traditional healer. Severina had come here with her two aunts because her aunts were sick and in desperate need of help from the curandero. So 2 weeks earlier, Severina's aunts had come down with these horrible fevers, and they had been in bed for days, and they had both been so tired and so weak that they could barely move or even eat. However, despite eating, both of their stomachs had swollen up like balloons, and then the skin on the outside of their stomachs had actually turned black, almost like the skin itself was dying. And it was at that point that Severina decided that her aunts could no longer afford to just hope this goes away on its own. They needed to go see a professional, go see the local healer. And so now Severina watched as her two aunts were told by the curandero to lie down on these mats in the middle of the floor. And both aunts they're very weak and sick, but they lie down. And the curandero, as they're lying down, lit incense and began waving it over their bodies. And then he inspected their faces and also their black stomachs. Then, a moment later, he turned his attention to this folded up blanket that was sitting near the aunts' heads. He took the blanket and he unfurled it and sort of laid it out in front of him, and then wrapped up inside of this blanket was a small pile of coca leaves. And the curandero, he picked out a few of these leaves and just sort of appeared to scatter them on the blanket. And then he appeared to study the leaves, like he was looking for signs that the leaves were going to give him. And Severina knew that these leaves were telling him what was wrong with her aunts. Finally, the curandero, after looking at these leaves for a bit, he looked up at Severina and told her that her aunts were sick with a blood curse, which meant that the blood flowing through their veins was literally cursed with dark magic. But that wasn't all. The curandero went on, telling Severina that this was actually not just a blood curse, but it was a family blood curse, which meant that someday she, Severina, would also get this curse and very likely die. When Severina heard this, a chill ran through her body, and she almost instinctively began scratching at her arms, like she could scratch this curse, out of her skin or something. But the curandero looked at her and just said, "There's nothing you can do. There's no cure for you or your aunts. Your fate and theirs is sealed." A few days later, Severina was back in her own home, in her own kitchen, making some herbal tea for her aunts, who were staying in her guest bedroom. And as she prepared this tea, all she could hear was the sound of her aunts moaning in pain and agony in the other room. So Severina, as quickly as she could, she finished making the tea and then hustled into the guest bedroom. So over the past few days, after leaving the curandero's hut, Severina's aunts had gotten sicker and sicker and sicker. They now couldn't eat anything, and they were constantly so dizzy they could barely even lift their heads up off their pillow, and they both just seemed so weak and so depleted, and their stomachs were still black and bloated, and they had these agonizing stomach cramps basically all the time. It was obvious that they were dying. And their sickness had just been horrifying for Severina to watch on many levels. And so at this point, all Severina was really trying to accomplish was just doing her best to try to make her aunts as comfortable as possible, until they died. And so now Severina walked over and she sort of assisted one of the aunts and had them sit up, and she tried to give her some of this tea that she had made. But when her aunt just smelled the herbal tea, she began to dry heave, and Severina jumped out of the way just as her aunt threw up bile all over her own lap. Immediately, the smell of this vomit and the smell of death and just the smell of filth that was filling this room, it just went right up Severina's nostrils, and she had to immediately run from the room and go outside where she vomited just from being so grossed out by being in that room. Severina felt completely overwhelmed by what was happening here. I mean, she obviously was just devastated to see her aunts in this condition. But what was even worse is it was like she was sort of watching what was going to happen to her, and she just couldn't believe it. And so she thought to herself, any day now, I'm going to begin showing symptoms that shows I too have this blood curse, and I'm going to begin withering away and then rotting until I die. And as she had this thought, she found herself again scratching at her arms as if somehow she could rip this illness out of her body before it took her life. Later that same night, after Severina had composed herself and gone back into the house, she had seen that her aunts did need more tea. And so she had left to go get more herbal tea remedies from the curandero. But after getting it and coming back to her house, she found that both of her aunts by this point had died. And the moment she saw them, Severina was overcome with both grief and also fear. Over the next few weeks, as she buried her aunts and grieved for them alongside her family, what she really was thinking about is, when is this blood curse gonna kill me too? And as months turned into years and still she didn't get sick, Severina began to wonder if maybe the curandero had been wrong. Maybe she didn't have this blood curse. Maybe it wasn't a family curse. But then, 30 years later, in the fall of 2018, when Severina was 57 years old, she woke up one morning with a stomach cramp, and she also felt very nauseous and a little dizzy. And even though by this point it's been 30 years since her aunts died of this illness, she knew immediately on that morning that the curse had finally arrived and it was now going to kill her. So she forced herself to get out of bed, and then she walked outside to where her husband and her daughter were sitting and having coffee. And she told them what was going on here. And when she told her family that she has this blood curse and there's nothing they can do, her daughter, whose name was Janet, said, "Wait a minute, Mom, go to a doctor." But Severina argued that there was no point because the curandero 30 years ago had told her that nothing would help, and she had watched her aunts die from this very thing. Like, there was nothing she could do. She was doomed. But Janet begged her mother to just forget what you were told 30 years ago. Forget all that and just go see a doctor. Even if they can't do anything, just go. And eventually, Severina relented and said, "Fine, I'll go to the doctor, even though it's not going to help." So later that day, they made the long journey into the nearest city to go see a doctor. At the doctor's office, a doctor took blood samples and ran tests on Severina and listened carefully as she explained the family blood curse. And as Severina and her family waited for the test results to come back, she braced herself because she knew that the doctor would say that, "Sorry, yep, the tests show there's nothing we can do here." And finally, the doctor did come back into the room and he told Severina that she was right. The curandero had been right. This was blood related. There was something in her blood. And immediately Severina just kind of collapsed in her chair because she knew what came next was an agonizing death, the same way her aunts had died. But then the doctor told her what this blood curse actually was. And at first, Severina was just really confused by what the doctor was saying. But then, as she's hearing this new information, she remembered all the times when she was younger, when she would reflexively itch her skin when she thought about the blood curse, like she would itch to scratch it out of her body. It was almost like this reflexive thing that she was doing, not realizing that every time she scratched her arms, she was quite literally giving herself the curse. It would turn out the so-called blood curse that Severina's aunts had was actually caused by a parasite. And it was true, Severina also had this blood curse. She too had a parasite in her body that would do the same thing. But Severina's parasite, it went dormant inside of her body for more than 30 years. So no symptoms, nothing for 30 years, just living inside of her skin. In many parts of South America, there is a bug called the vinchuca, which is essentially a type of bed bug. The bug itself is harmless, but there's a parasite that lives in the bug's feces. when the bug bites its victims and its victims scratch at the bites, they break the surface of their skin and infect themselves with this parasite. Then the parasite can lay dormant in the person's blood, sometimes for decades. Now, a lot of people don't even realize they have this because they never have symptoms ever. But if symptoms do appear without any real treatment, the person suffers organ damage or even dies. Luckily, in Severina's case, when her parasite became active again 30 years later, she was able to receive treatment for the parasite and would make a full recovery. On March 15, 2011, just after 1 p.m., 16-year-old Marcus Freeman sat behind the wheel of his dad's pickup truck, belting out the lyrics to one of his favorite songs on the radio as he and his girlfriend Carly drove down a highway in Northport, Florida. The pair had just left the dentist, where Marcus had just gotten some dental work done, and in fact his jaw was pretty sore. But he was basically singing right now, as was Carly, in order to distract himself from the pain. And for the most part this worked, but every time a song ended, it's like all he could think about was just how sore his jaw was. But Marcus was not like your typical 16-year-old kid. You know, he was sort of accustomed to having discomfort in his life, both physical discomfort and mental discomfort. And he really worked hard to be someone who was able to push through discomfort, including things like jaw pain. So he was the quarterback of his varsity football team at his high school, Northport High. And over the last year, he'd really begun to focus on his physical fitness. And so he'd begun doing these really difficult physical workouts that were sort of like, vomit-inducing. And then also, Marcus, he was, for the most part, pretty mentally well-adjusted. But, nerves were definitely a thing. He's the quarterback of the varsity high school team. He's only 16 years old. And so, nerves before games and just generally some level of anxiety sort of existed in his life. And so he would, work with a counselor at his school to try to overcome those nerves and try to manage those feelings when he was about to perform. So a different type of pain, but nonetheless, it's like this was a kid who was very forward-leaning when it came to sort of dealing with pain and discomfort and managing it. And all this hard work that Marcus was doing to sort of become the strongest version of himself he could be appeared to be paying off. Because, for example, the football team that he was the quarterback of, historically for years, they had been sort of terrible. But now, under Marcus's leadership and, him being the quarterback, they were now coming off one of their best seasons ever. And actually, it was not even just Marcus and the football team that appeared to be on the upswing these days. The whole school was. Northport High used to have terrible sports sort of across the board, and also low graduation rates and bad test scores. Like, this was not a high-performing school. But now, it had totally turned a corner. Most of the sports programs beyond football were all improving, grades and test scores across the board were all improving, and also just students at this school just seemed happier and more well-adjusted. It was not just Marcus, it was like everybody. But there was a reason for this, and basically everybody who went to Northport knew what that reason was. There was one person to thank for this really positive change: Principal George Kenny. He'd been Northport's principal for a decade now, but in the last few years, he'd made some tweaks to the curriculum and put a ton more focus on individual student support. And the result of all of this appeared to be, Marcus and all of his classmates thriving. But right now, the pain in Marcus's jaw was really all he could think about. And it seemed to be getting more severe, and it was starting to actually make him feel sort of dizzy. But Marcus had been, working on pain management, and he sort of had some tactics and techniques that he would use when, pain got sort of overwhelming, whether it was physical pain in this case or mental anguish or whatever it was. Like, he was going to employ the tactics and techniques that he had been working on. And so Marcus, as he's driving and, Carly's singing next to him, he took a deep breath and tried to relax and just breathe and just think of anything else besides the pain. Just put his mind somewhere else. This was actually literally what he did, during football games when he'd be super exhausted and beat up, but, he's the leader of the team, he's the quarterback. Like, he has to find a way to push through that pain and keep going. And this is what he would do. He would do this mental exercise where he basically sort of let his mind drift away from the physical uncomfortability he was experiencing and just focus on other things. And it was sort of like meditative, and it generally worked. But this time, it just didn't appear to be working. His jaw pain, kept on throbbing, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. And then soon it sort of felt like the pain was growing, like it was radiating up his cheek into his whole head, and it was like really becoming overwhelming. But he stayed focused. He kept, trying to allow his mind to sort of separate from the pain. And all of a sudden, that throbbing pain in his jaw stopped. And Marcus relaxed because truly the pain was now gone. At the same time Marcus was sort of going through this mental exercise, in the passenger seat, Carly was fiddling with the radio, trying to find another good song to sing along to. Carly loved being with Marcus. So much so that she'd just gone to the dentist with him just so they could spend more time together. She felt like Marcus was super kind and he was funny, and when she was with him, they could just talk and laugh for hours, and it would just feel like a second. Except now, as Carly was still fiddling with the radio, she realized that Marcus was acting unusual. He was being really quiet. And actually, when she looked over at him and stared at him, she sort of gasped, because Marcus appeared to have gone almost like completely rigid. His arms were sort of stuck out in front of him, like gripping the steering wheel, but in this weird, stiff way. And his hands, they were turning white from gripping the steering wheel as tightly as he could. And then also his head was sort of tilted back, and his eyes actually were beginning to roll back into his head. And so when Carly saw that like literally his eyes were being taken off the road, she began screaming his name and snapping and clapping and being like, "Hey, what are you doing?" But Marcus didn't answer. He didn't even react. He just continued blazing along at nearly 100 miles an hour in this weird, like, rigid state. And so Carly, she really began to panic. She's screaming, she's grabbing Marcus, she's trying to, like, get him out of this trance he's in, but he just wouldn't move. He wouldn't look at her. It was like he was gone. And then Carly turned and looked out the windshield, and she screamed as the truck veered off the road and careened into a tree. And for Carly, as soon as that happened, everything went black. A few hours later, Carly opened her eyes, and her whole body ached and her head pounded, and at first she really had no idea where she was. But then she heard beeping sounds, which were coming from these machines near her, and she looked around and saw the room she was in was very white, and she realized she was definitely in a hospital. And once she realized that, it was like the whole terrible ordeal came rushing back to her. She remembered Marcus and how strange he had looked, rigid at the wheel, and then she remembered crashing and hitting that tree. And so as she's processing this horrible thing, a nurse came into the room, and Carly immediately asked them, like, where is Marcus and when could she talk to Marcus? But that's when she found out from the nurse that Marcus was dead. Almost a month later, on April 8th, Carly was now out of the hospital, sitting in her Spanish class at Northport High School. And she was trying her best to pay attention to what the teacher was saying, but concentration was not something that came easily to Carly these days. Physically, she had healed from the accident, but emotionally, she had not. Marcus's death had truly devastated her, but perhaps the worst part of his death was there was just no good explanation for it. Like, why was he acting the way he was acting before they crashed? What happened to him? Like, what was going on? And truly, at this point, it was still just a huge mystery to basically everyone. Now, the media had come out and said that what happened was Marcus simply lost control of his vehicle. But Carly was right there with Marcus, and that did not seem like what happened. Again, Marcus, went into this trance of sorts, and it was him being sort of locked in that position that ultimately caused the car to, at 100 miles an hour, veer off the road and crash. But there was no weather, there were no obstacles in the road. It was like whatever caused Marcus to freeze up is what caused the crash, but it was like nobody was talking about it or nobody understood it. Now, there were some theories about maybe what could have caused Marcus to act that way, in particular at the high school, at Northport High. People believed that, maybe Marcus, when he was at the dentist, had gotten some kind of sedation that maybe he had had a bad reaction to, like a late onset bad reaction while they were driving home, and that caused him to stiffen up. Or maybe he had just had a random medical event that caused him to act that way. However, when his autopsy came out, it showed there had been no trace of drugs or any indication that Marcus had had anything like a seizure or a stroke or an aneurysm. So those theories were sort of pushed aside. But, this tragedy was considered an accident, not any sort of foul play. And so the police were not investigating further. They basically were there on site, they saw what happened, they documented it, but there was not like a deeper investigation happening here. So for Carly, she knew that it was very possible that she and everyone else would really never get the answers that they were looking for here, that it would just be a mystery what happened to Marcus. So for Carly, it just was really difficult to sort of just go back to normal life, go back to school and just be a kid again when there was this huge hole in her life that just felt like it was never going to be filled. But Carly was not the only one grieving here. Marcus had been incredibly popular at Northport High. And after their principal, Mr. Kenny, had notified the student body about his death, there had been a whirlwind of memorial services and student gatherings, and Mr. Kenny had made sure that counselors were brought into school to help kids process what had happened. And so now, as Carly sat there in her Spanish class, trying her best to concentrate, she suddenly heard the crackle of the school's announcement system kick on. And then she heard Mr. Kenny's voice, and he said he had something to tell them. And Carly could tell pretty much right away that whatever he was going to tell them was not going to be good news. Now, normally, Mr. Kenny was a very enthusiastic and very sort of positive person, but right now, his voice was very solemn and there was a slight tremor to it as he began to speak. And then at some point, he kind of stopped himself and he cleared his throat, and then he just said, "Another Northport student has just died." In the weeks following that announcement, Carly tried to wrap her head around how it was possible that 2 students had died at their school in 2 months. Now, the second death was not similar to Marcus's death in terms of how they died. The second death was self-inflicted. But still, Northport, which was a small, tight-knit school, was not a place where young people just suddenly started dying. Like, this didn't happen. But then, just weeks later in early May, Carly's confusion turned into outright disbelief when another Northport student died, also self-inflicted. And this really sent Carly and the rest of the already very fragile student body at Northport into a state of shock. 2 students dying so close together was already so difficult to process, but 3 was unthinkable. And so now it was like the entire student body was on edge, like almost bracing for more awful news, like more deaths. It just almost felt inevitable. However, one night soon after the third death, Carly was at her home in her room on her computer, scrolling around on Facebook, when she saw a post from another classmate. And when she read what this person had written, which was very short, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of this sooner. This person's post pointed out that all 3 of these deaths had one thing in common. So many students and staff and parents at Northport High believed that the school's overall recent improvements in athletics and testing and general student satisfaction were all because of their principal, Mr. Kenny. Mr. Kenny was very student-focused, and he offered the kids at Northport a lot of individual attention. But he also had a secret. So over the last 3 years, Mr. Kenny had been meeting with students and staff members to resolve various personal issues like people's anxiety or pain management or mental health issues, test scores, being better at concentrating. Like, he was there and working with people to try to sort of make them the best version of themselves. To do this, he put the students and the staff members under hypnosis. Mr. Kenny would invite sometimes as many as 2 students a day into his office for these private recorded hypnosis sessions, and he would do the same thing for teachers. He even sometimes brought entire school sports teams into his office, and he would hypnotize them before games to improve performance. But critically, Mr. Kenny not only performed the hypnotism himself, he also taught the students how to do it on themselves. Mr. Kenny had only ever taken a brief course in hypnosis, and certainly did not have a license to be, using it to diagnose or resolve actual mental health issues or even physical issues. Like, he was not licensed to be doing this. But a lot of kids really responded to his sessions and reported improvements in their anxiety and their focus, and some athletes started excelling in their sports. But along with these good developments, there were some alarming side effects. Some Northport parents reported that their children began experiencing these strange personality changes, and they would have these blank stares on their faces after they had begun hypnosis with Mr. Kenny. Others said that after these sessions, their child became disoriented or started doing things they wouldn't normally do, or began thinking about hurting themselves. And so after the third student death, that Facebook post that Carly found had revealed that all 3 of those students had been repeatedly hypnotized by Mr. Kenny. Now, Mr. Kenny swore he was not the one responsible for these deaths, but he was charged with practicing therapeutic hypnosis without a license, and he did receive a year of probation. In addition, the Sarasota County School Board paid a total of $600,000 to the 3 victims' families, and as for Mr. Kenny, he has since retired from teaching. Shortly after 8 p.m. on October 9, 1996, 31-year-old Anthony Irvin walked down a dark sidewalk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, towards a local grocery store. It was not that cold outside, but, it was kind of windy and it was dark, and, Anthony, he only had a light jacket on, and so he wasn't feeling that comfortable, and so he pulled his jacket tight around him as he walked, and as he was walking, all he wanted to do was just go home where it was warm. But he couldn't. He really needed money first. Once he had money, then he could go home. So Anthony had a pretty tough life, and for the most part, he really was just a career criminal. He had not had a regular job in a very long time, and instead, when he needed money, like tonight, he would steal from local businesses or he would mug people. In the past 9 years, he'd been arrested 8 times for things like robbery and assault. And so, for the most part, he was just a huge nuisance to the people in this neighborhood. Even if they felt bad for him, he was just a problem. But, despite how often he committed crimes, his crimes were always relatively petty. And so he really didn't serve much time at all in prison. He always ended up back out on the street, and he always ended up continuing to, be a problem. But tonight, though, as Anthony walked down the road, he was not thinking about how his behavior impacted his neighbors. He was thinking about finding some place or someone to rob. And tonight in particular, he thought, I'm gonna look for a person. I need a target. And so he's walking down the road, and he actually began to get kind of worried because it seemed like it was quieter than usual out on the street. Like there was nobody out here. And he started to worry that if he didn't find somebody soon, like he was gonna be out of luck, no money. But just then, right up ahead, a young man turned the corner and began walking up the sidewalk in Anthony's direction. He was sort of a smaller, younger-looking guy. He appeared to be all alone, and right away, Anthony's like, oh my goodness, perfect. I have my mark. I'm gonna rob this guy. And so Anthony, he begins walking towards, this unsuspecting young man, and as he got closer, Anthony realized he knew who this guy was. This was Harry, his neighbor. And he's like, oh my gosh, perfect, because I know Harry is super soft-spoken and gentle, like he's so calm. He's not gonna do anything. Like, he's gonna be so easy to rob. Yeah, it's horrible to rob your neighbor. He's gonna know I did it, but what's he gonna do? So Anthony marches right up to Harry and he stops right in front of him, blocking his path. And then Anthony delivers, his classic mugging threat. A few minutes later, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department named Perry Kelly drove his cruiser fast down a city street. He'd been called to the area about a mugging, and he was hopeful he would get there in time to potentially catch the mugger, or at least see who they were or see where they went, so that maybe he could catch them. And so Kelly, he turns the corner and he pulls up in front of the address where he's been told to go. And as he's pulling up, he sees there are 2 men out on the sidewalk. One is lying motionless on the ground, and the other is sitting on top of him, and Kelly's thinking, Perfect. I have caught the mugger. Like, he's the one on top of the other. I've caught him in the act. Great. I'm going to jump out of the car and arrest this guy. But no. When Kelly got out of the car and learned what actually happened here, this became easily the strangest thing he had ever come across in his 25-year career. So when Anthony mugged people, what he would do is he would put his hand into his coat pocket and he would press his fingers forward like he had a gun in his pocket. And he would sort of aim his hand inside of his jacket towards the person he was mugging. And he would say to them, as soon as he walked up to them, like, hey, I got a gun, give me all your money or I'm gonna shoot you. And they would often look down, they'd see what they thought was a gun in his jacket, although they couldn't be sure. And, instead of questioning whether really Anthony had a gun or not, they would just hand over their money. Like, it wasn't worth it. Here, take my money. And Anthony would take their money and run off, right? So this worked most of the time. And he's thinking, Harry, here's my easy mark. This young, meek kid, I'm going to use the same thing on him. It's going to be so easy. And so he walks up to Harry and literally stands in front of him and blocks his way. And Harry actually kind of walks into him and is like, what's going on? And Anthony, he delivers the line. He's got his hand in the pocket, pretending he's got his gun. And he's like, hand over all your money or I'm going to shoot. But Harry, whether or not he believed that Anthony had a gun or not, he actually had virtually no way of confirming it one way or another because Harry was actually blind. And Anthony knew Harry was blind because they were neighbors. And that was a big reason why he thought this was going to be so easy. I'm going to rob the slight blind kid. That's what I'm going to do. But what Anthony didn't realize is that in addition to being blind, Harry also happened to be a karate master and a master wrestler as well. And so when Harry was suddenly being told, you're going to get shot if you don't hand over your money, his instincts kicked in and he grabbed Anthony, flipped him over his shoulder and slammed him into the ground and broke his neck and killed him. And then he sat on top of his body until police arrived. Harry was never charged in connection with Anthony's death since it was determined he acted in self-defense. And even though the media called him a hero for defending himself, Harry actually felt terrible that he had killed Anthony. He didn't mean to, he was just protecting himself. And so he called the whole thing a tragedy. On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help, but because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing, 90 miles away full time. And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate, and as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning, and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition. Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows, arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do, because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in Sealing. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, "Don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it." But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, "Is mom home?" And Tad said, "No, she's still not here." Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, "We gotta call the police." 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So, Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now, Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed, and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, he said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like some place if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, so on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend repeatedly to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble, to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise. Because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed, as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him, and Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that His plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere, and then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was like so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. Like, he expected her to come home. Like, this couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janet Dennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer, Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach, like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, where were you on Friday night, which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday, and now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill, because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, yep, Jim failed his test, which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. I mean, because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with huge adoration. I mean, they really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling, and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around ceiling that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes. But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, hey, would you mind taking this test again? But Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left, to sign a consent to search form which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, sure. The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Undersheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the Undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now, Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire, and it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt this surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that This woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel, and she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time, and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news, because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out. Nobody knew what happened to Janet. She had not turned up. It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, he wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now, Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy, who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again, and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, "I have more information about Janet, and it might be important." And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. On the morning of April 29, 1963, a woman named Sofia Perez was riding in the passenger seat of her car. Her husband Julian was driving, and they were traveling down a narrow city street in Sevilla, Spain. It was a Monday, but Julian, who was the primary breadwinner, he didn't have work that day. And so the couple had decided, since it was such a beautiful spring day as well, that they would get out and go on a nice drive and just spend some time together. And for Sofia, this was like a perfect day. She adored her husband, and she really loved the city of Sevilla. All the people there were so nice and friendly, and it was such a beautiful place that this was shaping up to be really a tremendous day. And so Sofia and her husband, they are all smiles as they continue driving down this road. Sofia, she's looking out, taking in the sights and the sounds, and then at some point, she just has this inclination to pull out her lipstick and, apply her lipstick. And so she reaches down and she grabs her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. She was a very organized person. And she opened it up and she's rifling through it and she finds her lipstick, and then she grabs the rear view mirror and she turns it and she uses it to apply the lipstick. And as she's doing this, she begins asking Julian, hey, what should we do for the rest of the day? Beyond this drive, what else should we do? And as she's sort of half looking at the mirror and half looking at Julian, she sees a blur of motion out in front of the car. And then she turns and she realizes there's someone in the intersection that they're gonna hit. It's a guy on a motorcycle. And before she could say anything, Julian is swerving hard to the right to try to avoid this guy. It's like absolute madness. And then the motorcyclist, he tips over and he goes into a slide. And then Julian and Sophia, they ram off the road onto the sidewalk and smash into this huge pole. And pretty much right away, Sophia, after the car had come to a stop in front of this huge, metal pole, Sophia began like patting herself down to sort of assess the damage, to make sure she was okay. And then she looked over at her husband, Julian, who was sort of doing the same thing, and they realized that, obviously despite the horribleness of this crash, that they were okay. But then their attention turned to the motorcyclist, because even though Julian didn't hit him, they narrowly missed him. He swerved away and they crashed into this pole. Despite that, one of the last things Sophia saw before they swerved is the motorcyclist had tipped over and gone into a skid, so they had no idea if he was okay or not. And so Sophia and Julian, they carefully climbed out of their pretty wrecked vehicle, and again, they stood and kind of checked to make sure they really were okay, because now they're standing for the first time, but they're okay. And they walked a little ways, across the street to this other sort of side street where the motorcyclist had skidded off to. And right over there, he was standing. The man who was on the motorcycle, he was standing next to his bike. And, obviously his bike had had some damage done to it, but the man, the motorcyclist, he looked unhurt as well. So this was like an enormous, in some ways, stroke of luck. Obviously, it was bad to get into the accident, but all three of them appeared to be okay. And so Sophia and Julian, they walk over to the motorcyclist, and, the three of them were really amicable. I mean, the motorcyclist understood that, accidents happen, thank goodness nobody was hurt. And just for a few minutes, the three of them just chatted and sort of just talked about how lucky they really were here. And they exchanged information, so they could cover the damages if they needed to of the respective vehicles. And as they're just sitting there having this, relatively calm and just normal conversation here, Sophia looks over at Julian and she realizes, he was basically unhurt, but not entirely unhurt. He had this scratch on his face that was bleeding a fair amount that very likely was from the crash. And even though by no means is this like life-threatening or anything like that, Sophia was not at the moment talking to the motorcyclist. And so she figured she would just go back over to the car and grab her purse, because she's very organized and she has something in that purse for every situation. She figured she very likely had like a bandage or something she could use to clean up her husband's cut. And so she told her husband and the motorcyclist she was gonna go get her purse and go grab a bandage or something. She goes over to the car, which is still smashed up on the side of the road, of course, and there's a little bit of a crowd of people sort of relatively nearby, kind of assessing the scene. She makes her way around towards the passenger side because her purse was still in the car in the passenger seat. And as she was coming around, getting ready to reach through the open door to grab her purse, which was sitting right there on the seat, something happened. Like she got close enough to the car where like suddenly she felt this intense pain all through her body. And then it was like she couldn't even move, and she found herself falling towards the ground, looking up at the sky, and like her muscles are beginning to spasm. And the last thing she saw was her husband and the motorcyclist running over to her. And then to her horror, as she's laying there looking up at them, they too began to sort of seize up and spasm and fall to the ground right next to her. It would turn out that when Julian swerved to avoid that motorcyclist and crashed into that pole, neither he nor Sophia realized that that pole was actually connected to a power line that held up electrical lines carrying a huge amount of electrical voltage. And during the crash, a few of those lines from the pole had been knocked down to the ground, and they fell around Sophia and Julian's car. When the couple first got out of the vehicle, they sort of miraculously avoided stepping on those lines. And if they had just stayed over there, with the motorcyclist and just hadn't gone back to the vehicle, they would have been fine. But Sophia, whose purse always had exactly what she needed, was in the car and she wanted to get it and get that bandage. And so when she went back, she stepped on one of those lines and she was electrocuted. And so she's on the ground, she can't move, and her husband and the motorcyclist, they see this happening, they hear it happening, and they run over unaware of the danger, and they too are hit by those electrical lines. They fall to the ground, and all three were electrocuted to death. On January 11th, 2018, around 10 a.m., 55-year-old Ray Wright sawed through a wooden board inside of his workshop, which was located about 20 minutes outside of Rockland, California. Now, Ray had only just begun his workday, but he was already covered in sawdust. However, he barely noticed, because this was just a normal part of his job as a carpenter, something he absolutely loved. He loved his career. In fact, Ray really just sort of loved everything about his life and sort of how it was going these days. And that had not always been the case. So about 6 years earlier, Ray was in a very different and much worse place in his life. He'd been recently divorced and had started drinking a lot, and he'd spiraled, further and further out of control until one night he'd gotten really drunk and then hopped behind the wheel, and he caused a terrible accident when he crashed head-on into another vehicle. Now, Ray was more or less okay after that crash, but he'd actually severely injured the people in the car that he had hit. And so Ray had been arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison, and he was ordered to pay a huge monetary settlement to the victims of this crash. And so really, this had been like the true rock bottom moment of Ray's life. But by the time Ray actually got out of jail, he was determined to really turn his life around and become a better person. He'd stopped drinking, and he had joined Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a very well-known support group that helps keep people sober. He'd started spending way more time with his 3 kids and also his brother Dean, and he'd been renting this particular workshop that he was in right now to revamp his carpentry business, Ray Wright Design. And then also, in addition to these specific behavioral changes, overall, Ray had made this huge effort to really shift his thinking about the way he approached life. He decided he was gonna really try hard to just have a much more positive attitude in general and just try to be happier. He believed it was more of a mindset, and he really was trying hard to stay in that positive, happy mindset. However, despite these wholesale changes in Ray's behavior and his mindset, which were definitely all good, the one thing he was up against that was very difficult to change, since coming out of prison, was his financial situation. I mean, he really just didn't make a whole lot of money, despite working really hard as a carpenter now. He just didn't make a lot of money. And this really didn't just affect his life, it affected other people's lives as well. Because, he needed to make those huge settlement payments to the victims of the crash, which he intended to do. But so far, he had not made enough money to make those payments, and it was definitely stressing him out. He knew he needed to make those payments, but Ray was sort of determined that he would just continue to work really hard, continue to build up his business, continue to stay positive, stay happy, be a good person, and eventually he was sure to make these payments and everything would be okay. So in essence, Ray still had problems, but he was working really hard to just stay on the straight and narrow and do the right thing. Now, Ray blew some of the sawdust off the board that he had just cut, and he set it aside. And then, as he was about to start on the next thing, he realized one of the tools that he needed was out in his truck. So he walked through the shop's big warehouse-style doors that opened out onto a dirt driveway. So the workshop where Ray worked was in a fairly rural area with only one immediate neighbor who lived in a trailer right next door on the same property. And the person who owned the trailer was a woman named Katie. But, despite there only being Katie next door, there was still a fair amount of people just sort of coming and going around the place, like Katie's friends and Ray's clients, so the area was actually usually pretty lively. But this morning, as he stepped outside onto the driveway, it was pretty quiet. So Ray just made his way out to his truck and grabbed what he needed from inside, and then he turned and began walking back towards the shop. However, before he actually got to the shop, he heard footsteps on the driveway right behind him. 2 days later, Ray's brother Dean drove his car through some back roads as he made his way towards Ray's house in Rockland, California. Dean had just been to Ray's workshop, and now he was making the 20-minute drive back to Ray's home yet again. And the reason he was doing that is because Dean was really worried. He hadn't heard from his brother in 2 days, and neither had Ray's kids or any of Ray's friends. And this was very unusual. Dean, himself talked to Ray every single day, and he also knew that Ray was a very involved and responsive dad who would definitely not just disappear on his kids, and he was also definitely in touch with other friends. I mean, this was just very unusual for Ray. So over the past 48 hours, Dean had been increasingly getting more and more worried about Ray. He had been talking to anyone he could to try to figure out why his brother was just suddenly gone. He'd already gone to Ray's workshop and his house repeatedly, and he hadn't found Ray or any sign of Ray or any sign of where he might have gone. And also Ray's truck was nowhere to be found either. And that was actually particularly concerning because, deep down, Dean was worried that, despite the changes Ray had made in his life to be a better person and to do right by people, he was worried that, maybe Ray had fallen off the wagon and was drinking again. Maybe that's why he's gone. He's on a bender somewhere. Now, Dean really didn't want to face that reality. That would be devastating for so many reasons, not to mention, if Ray was off drinking somewhere, who knows what trouble he could be in. He could be in a lot of trouble or hurt or something. And so Dean, by this point, 48 hours into his brother's disappearance, he's just doing his best to kind of push down this growing concern that maybe that's what happened. And in fact, it was actually that sort of nagging fear that Dean had that had kept him from going to the police and reporting Ray missing. There was just this fear that if he did that, it would sort of expose Ray if he was, not doing what he was supposed to be doing. And so by this point, Dean had held off. Now, Dean parked his car outside of Ray's house again, and he got out and, Ray's truck was not back yet. But Dean was determined that he would just go back inside and take another look around to see if maybe he had missed something. Maybe there was some clue as to where, Ray went or what he was up to. So Dean walked up to his brother's front door and he let himself inside, and immediately Dean stopped because he smelled something. It smelled like marijuana smoke inside the house, which was really, really odd. One, because the last time he was here, he definitely did not smell marijuana smoke, but more than that, Ray, his brother, had definitely once been a very heavy drinker. That was true. But he had always hated marijuana. He did not smoke marijuana. And so Dean's standing in the doorway trying to make sense of this, when from the other side of the room, he hears somebody shouting at him to leave. And he sees on the other side of the room, this man has suddenly popped up who Dean did not know, who was looking right at him, basically gesturing for Dean to get out of the house. But Dean, he's sort of what's going on here? He looks at this guy and he's like, who are you? What are you doing in here? And the guy went very quickly from being sort of demanding to Dean to very spooked, turning and sprinting out the door, out of sight. Within the hour, a police officer with the Rockland Police Department pulled his cruiser up outside of a small one-story home in Rockland and parked. He saw a man waiting outside the garage, and as the officer got out of his car, the man rushed up and introduced himself as Dean, the person who had called 911. Dean explained to the officer that he had just seen an intruder here inside of his brother's home, and that his brother was also missing. And so the officer took down some notes, both about the intruder and also about, Dean's brother's absence and why him being gone for 2 days was really out of character. And so after the officer finished speaking to Dean, he went inside of Ray's house to take a look around and see if, there was any evidence left behind by the intruder to indicate who they were, or if there was any evidence about, where Ray was, and maybe that this intruder had something to do with Ray's absence. But once inside the home, the officer saw there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of mess or violence, so it didn't immediately seem like the intruder had robbed the place or gotten into some kind of physical fight with its owner. But still, the officer left the property and went back to his cruiser and called it in. And so over the next few days, the Rockland Police Department sort of led 2 parallel investigations. There was the investigation into this intruder inside of Ray's home, which really wasn't going very far. They had very little evidence. There was barely a description of this guy from Dean, who did not get a good look at him. And then the other investigation was into Ray's disappearance. And there was definitely some thinking that the intruder and Ray's disappearance could be connected, but as of right now, they didn't know. But with regards to Ray's disappearance, after the police had spoken to Ray's family and friends, they determined that no one had seen or spoken to him since January 11th. That was the first sort of hard date and hard fact that they had. They also checked into Ray's bank account and phone activity, and they learned he hadn't used them since January 11th, when apparently he went missing. But beyond those details, as the weeks went on, really nothing else came in, not about the intruder or about Ray. Then on January 21st, so 10 days after Ray went missing, the Rockland Police Department got their first, big new lead. and that was Ray's truck had been found. He was not in it. It had been found totally abandoned in this apartment complex that was not far from his workshop. A couple of months later, on an afternoon in late March, Rockland Police Sergeant Zach Lewis sat at his desk at the station going over Ray's case file for what he felt like was the millionth time. So, since finding Ray's truck, basically no new leads had come in. And even that, the finding of Ray's truck really had not been the break that the police had really hoped it would be. The truck was basically in decent working condition. The only thing that really stood out was the plates had been taken off of it. But after they searched the truck extensively, they basically didn't find anything. Nothing that gave away what happened to Ray or where he was, or, whether or not this intruder had something to do with Ray. It just really didn't go anywhere. So Sergeant Lewis was feeling pretty stuck when it came to this case. And so right now he was just looking through the information they already had on this case to see if maybe he had missed something. However, as he began doing this, another officer ran through the station towards his desk, waving around some sheets of paper. And this officer ran right up to Lewis, and he slammed the papers down on his desk and explained that the California Highway Patrol had just sent a report over because they thought it might contain a lead in Ray's case. And here was the lead. And so Lewis is really excited. He grabs the document, and he sees it's a report. And it's about this van that had gotten in an accident at the end of January, a few miles south of Rockland in Sacramento. The driver of this van had been extremely drunk and was going over 100 miles an hour when he crashed. And somewhat miraculously, nobody got hurt, including the driver. And so the driver, he survives, and now he's facing all these charges of drunk driving and reckless driving. But the reason this report was sent over to Rockland was because the driver was a man named Victor Gray. That's what his license said. So after the crash, the police discovered that the license plate on the van that Victor had been driving was definitely the right license plate. However, the registration stickers that were on the license plates were not the right ones. Basically, Victor or somebody had taken stickers from some other vehicle and put them on this van's plates to give the impression that their vehicle, this van, was registered. But when they tracked those registration stickers, they discovered those stickers actually belonged to Ray Wright's abandoned truck. Now, Rockland's police department knew this was a huge lead, and they could not screw it up. And so they wanted to make sure that they handled, whatever they did next exactly right, and they leveraged whatever resources they could get. So, over the next few weeks, Lewis and his team reached out to the FBI to help them process Victor's van and collect any potential evidence that was associated with Ray's disappearance. And a little over a month later, on May 8, 2018, Lewis stood with a few of his other officers in a parking lot not far from Rockland, watching as a team of FBI agents searched Victor's van. Now, by this point, they had discovered that this van not only had Ray's registration stickers on it, but also inside of the van was a lot of Ray's stuff. They had found Ray's glasses, which were smashed. They had found Ray's cell phone, which was also smashed. They found his wallet. They found a hat that said Ray Wright design on it. And critically, they found Ray's rain jacket, and it was covered in blood and partially charred, like it had been burned. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious to investigators that Ray was not just missing. He didn't just, go off the wagon and start drinking again and go disappear somewhere. No. He very likely had been killed, and very likely this guy Victor Gray had something to do with it. But the problem was there was no obvious connection between Victor Gray and Ray Wright, like they were total strangers. And when they tried to speak to Victor, to interrogate him, to try to get him to open up and explain if he had something to do with this, if he knew who Ray was, Victor was not talking. So that was a total dead end. And so now investigators were just hoping that, whatever evidence they found in this van, that once it was, sent off and analyzed, that hopefully that would sort of maybe begin to explain what actually happened here. Was this just a random robbery gone wrong? Victor was just robbing Ray and it got violent? Or was it something else? Or who knows what? They just didn't know. Now, Lewis watched as the FBI agents wrapped up the search of the van and, they began packing things up, so it was clear they had sort of pulled all the evidence they were going to pull. And, Sergeant Lewis and his team, they were about to leave when suddenly one of the FBI agents who was searching the front of the van in the front two seats, he began waving his arm like he had found something. And so Lewis and the others, they go running over and they look inside the van, and this agent is pointing down to like the center of the front of this van, basically near the center console. And there was this little space underneath the center console that apparently nobody had looked in yet. And inside of this little space was another cell phone. 5 months later, on an afternoon in October, Lewis pulled his cruiser into the dirt driveway right outside of Ray's workshop. But when Lewis and the other detective that he was with got out of their car, they ran past Ray's workshop and went to the trailer next door, where Lewis knew a woman named Katie Barnard lived. And so Lewis stood back as the other detective knocked on the door of the trailer, and a few seconds later, a very timid-looking woman, Katie, came to the door and she asked what was going on. And when Lewis explained to her why they were there, Katie went from looking timid to looking downright terrified, and she just began to shake, like she clearly understood why they were here. So they took her down to the station, and pretty much as soon as she was sitting inside of an interrogation room and they began asking her questions, Katie just completely broke and told them everything she knew. So ever since Ray got out of prison for that drunk driving accident, he really had been single-mindedly focused on trying to be a better person and not letting his rock bottom moment sort of ruin his life. And he'd done a great job doing that. He'd gotten sober, he'd begun, spending much more time with his family. He was like a very present father now. He was very well liked in the community. However, even though Ray, had good intentions here, the reality was he was just sort of focusing on rebuilding his own life. He wasn't really trying to help other people. Like his post-jail efforts were sort of all about him. And his self-improvement journey had really not been beneficial for everyone, because Ray had really not truly atoned or done right by the person he had hurt the most, one of the victims of his drunk driving accident, a man named Bob Manor. Bob had been absolutely furious with Ray after the accident because the accident had severely injured him, Bob, to the point where Bob had a permanent limp. And then Ray had stopped making those court-mandated settlement payments to Bob. He was supposed to, but he just wasn't making them. And so Bob is like incensed. It's like, how dare you? You hurt me, you hurt my family, and you're not even paying for it. Like, jail isn't enough. And so for Bob, it became like an obsession that he really wanted to get his revenge on Ray. And it just so happened that Bob was not just a guy with a grudge. Bob was a very violent drug dealer as well. So this was a really big deal for him. So basically, after Ray got out of prison, Bob began obsessing over where Ray was. Like, he wanted to literally discover his address so he could physically go and take his revenge, but he couldn't find Ray. He could not find the information. No one was going to give it to him, for this reason exactly. And so he was just furious all the time. He wants to find Ray, but he has no way of knowing where he lives. Then, just by pure happenstance, Bob ends up dating a woman named Katie Barnard, who just so happens to live in the trailer right next door to the shop in Rockland, California, where Ray worked. And, Bob had no idea. He's just over visiting with Katie all the time. And one day he looks out the window, and who does he see walking out of the doors of that shop? Ray Wright. After that, and you have to understand that some of this stuff actually was never fully explained, Bob hired a man named Victor Gray to kidnap Ray for him, because he wasn't going to do it himself. He needed to catch Ray off guard. And so Victor Gray kidnaps Ray, and he apparently brings Ray to Bob so that Bob can exact his revenge on Ray. Now, we don't know exactly what happened once Bob potentially received Ray. We don't know if Ray ever actually made it to Bob, but we do know at some point Victor did kidnap Ray, and there was definitely revenge, on the agenda. But what Bob ultimately failed to do, that got him caught and got Victor caught and got this whole thing blown up was he didn't pay Victor for the kidnapping. So the very thing that Bob was so mad about really was like, how dare Ray do this to me and then not pay me? Well, Bob did the same thing to Victor. He didn't pay him. And Victor was also a violent person. He's a convicted felon, and he didn't take that lightly. And so what did he do? He wrote a letter to Bob, basically being like, hey, I kidnapped this guy for you, and I handed him to you. Like, I handed him over, and you haven't paid me yet. And then he took pictures of this letter, and those pictures were on that phone that was found underneath the center console of Victor Gray's van. Those pictures of this letter are what connected Victor to Bob, and then the connection from Bob to Ray was already known. And then also critically, because Victor hadn't been paid by Bob for this kidnapping, he took the liberty of not only kidnapping Ray, but he went back and stole the registration stickers off of Ray's truck, and he put them on his own van. And then ultimately, it was that led to Victor getting caught and this whole, con being exposed. Now, we actually don't know specifically what happened to Ray Wright. All we know is that he definitely was kidnapped and that Bob ordered the kidnapping, and that realistically, Bob is a pretty violent guy. Victor's a violent guy. There's blood found all over, Ray's stuff. It seemed pretty apparent that the revenge that was exacted on Ray involved his murder. But Ray's body was never found, and so we don't really know what happened to him. However, using overwhelming circumstantial evidence, both Bob Manor and Victor Gray were both convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and they were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Around 6:30 p.m. on December 10th, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff sat inside of a guard shack at the Kennecott Copper Mine in northern Utah, reading a college textbook. The shack was barely big enough for one person to sit inside of, and there were windows on all four sides looking out into the total darkness. The sun was already down, and this was a really isolated part of the mine with no lights or other buildings nearby, so apart from a little bit of moonlight on the snow, it was basically pitch black outside. Brian had worked as a security guard for this mine for a little over a year, but he'd only been stationed at this particular guard shack for a couple of weeks now. And in his opinion, it was the worst post he could have been assigned to. His job was to guard this chain link gate on a remote service road that led into the canyons. This was a really out-of-the-way entrance into the mine, which meant that not a lot of vehicles came this way. So the job was basically just really boring. But it was also simultaneously very dangerous. The Kennecott Copper Mine was known as the richest hole on Earth because of the huge amount of valuable materials buried there, including obviously copper and gold and silver. And that made it a big target for thieves. In fact, in just the past few months, more than $150,000 worth of material and equipment had been stolen from the mine. So as a result, Brian was a little bit nervous about being out here in the middle of nowhere. Not only because it was, pitch black outside, but also he was unarmed and there were no security cameras. So if he did encounter thieves, he basically had to handle it by himself, armed with nothing more than a telephone to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been, routine so far, slow and uneventful. So Brian was now just sort of passing the time studying. He was in nursing school and his final exams were coming up in a few days, so he was just sort of poring over his textbooks and notes to prepare. While he studied, he took out his thermos full of soup that he had brought for dinner. And just as he began eating the soup, the phone on his desk rang. Now, Brian immediately did want to answer the phone because he knew very likely it was his wife, Jennifer. But at the same time, right now, things at home were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had also started working nights at the mine to help support the family while he went to nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, it was hard to make ends meet. And now Jennifer was pregnant again with their second child, which was going to make things even harder financially. And the pressure of juggling school and work and parenthood had been putting a big strain on their marriage. And about a month ago, Brian had sort of reached a breaking point, and he'd actually walked out on his family. He'd left a note for Jennifer saying he just needed time alone to think. And then he had driven to his work, he had turned in his security badge and told his boss he quit, then he had left town, and he'd spent almost a week in Las Vegas. And eventually, he'd driven all the way out to San Francisco. But while he was there, having his time alone, he'd received word that his daughter was in the emergency room with pneumonia back home in Utah. And for Brian, it was like that was his wake-up call. He realized he could not live with himself if he truly abandoned his family. And so he drove right back to Utah to be with Jennifer and to be with his daughter, who would make a recovery. And, Jennifer, she would take Brian back, despite, him walking out on the family, at least for a short time. But her accepting him back into the fold did not sort of make them return to normal. In reality, after he returned, there just was this constant sense that there was tension hanging over their relationship because of what Brian had done, abandoning them. So now, in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath, and then he picked up the ringing phone, and for a few minutes, he just chatted on the phone, until he suddenly saw something out the window, a flash of headlights coming up the road towards his guard shack. And so at this point, Brian said he had to go, he hung up, and went right outside to meet the approaching vehicle. About an hour and a half later, so around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. The shack's lights were on, but he couldn't see anybody inside of it. And Todd found this pretty odd, because Brian wasn't supposed to leave his post under any circumstance. That was sort of like the main component to the job. You stay put. But making this even stranger was Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. And this shack is so far away from every other building that really there was no way for Brian to go anywhere without his car, especially not, in the freezing cold like it was that night. So where was Brian? And so Todd, who was definitely feeling a bit apprehensive at this point, he parked his car, he got out, and he walked into the shack. And when he got in there, it's a very small space, but Brian, was not in there, but there was a hat and a half-eaten dinner on the desk inside. And so at this point, Todd felt like, we have an issue. Like, I don't know where Brian is. Something seems off. So he picked up the phone inside the shack, and he called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig drove down a snowy desert road toward the Kennecott copper mine. Now, everybody knew this mine was a target for thieves. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had seemingly vanished into thin air in the middle of his shift, well, Detective Lassig went out right away to investigate, because the thought was, this could have been perpetrated by thieves. Maybe, Brian's been kidnapped or something. When Lassig pulled up to the mine's main entrance, there was another vehicle parked right in front, and it flashed its headlights at him. And then a man in a security guard's uniform rolled down the driver's side window and sort of waved Lassig over. And so Lassig pulled up next to this car, and the man in this other car told Lassig that he was Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had called in about the missing guard. Then after that, Todd started up his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so he did. He followed him off into the darkness, driving down this dark, winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennecott mine was 3 square miles wide, with rocky terrain and mountains on every side. So they were driving for a good 10 minutes before finally Lassig saw this light up ahead, which was the guard shack that Brian had been in. The two men pulled up near this shack and got out of their vehicles. And then Todd told Detective Lassig that this shack was where the guard, Brian Ruff, had last been stationed. And so Lassig, he turned on his flashlight and then aimed it at the ground right outside of the shack. But there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any footprints or tire tracks that might have helped them were now covered up. And so Lassig stepped inside of the shack. And at first glance, everything looked to be in order. There was no blood, nothing overturned, no sign of a struggle. But again, there was a hat, Brian's hat, and also Brian's half-eaten thermos of soup, his dinner, that was still just sitting on the desk, which was pretty conspicuous. And so Lassig is kind of taking the whole scene in, trying to make sense of what could have happened, coming up with maybe some theories here, looking for any clues of where to look next. And as he was doing that, the phone on the desk rang. And Detective Lassig just picked it up, and he asked who was calling. And the woman on the line sounded very surprised, and she said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to reach out to her husband, Brian Ruff. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department, and that her husband Brian had at some point this night left his post and now couldn't be found, and so he was literally looking for her husband. And so he asked Jennifer when was the last time she had spoken to Brian. And Jennifer, she was obviously taken aback by this news, but she said she had just spoken with her husband a couple hours ago. She said they were talking, and then suddenly Brian had to hang up because he said he saw a car coming up the road. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about this particular car that was approaching, or, who was driving the car or anything. But Jennifer said no, he didn't say anything, just that the car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was obviously disappointed that there wasn't more information here, but he still thanked Jennifer and told her, I promise I will be in touch with you as soon as I possibly can. I'm going to go out there and find your husband. Then he hung up the phone and he turned his attention back to the scene, the inside of this very small shack. But just a few seconds after he had put the phone down, the phone rang again. And so Lassig picked it up again, and once again, it was a woman saying she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And she was asking where Brian was, but as Lassig is listening, he's thinking, this woman doesn't sound anything like the woman I just spoke to literally a minute ago, who also said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And also, this second woman clearly doesn't have any recollection of the earlier conversation. Like, these are two different people who are both claiming to be Brian's wife, Jennifer. But obviously there could only be one, so one of these women had to be lying, right? On a morning in mid-December of 1991, so just a few days after Brian Ruff's disappearance from his remote guard shack, and still he had not been found yet, Detective Manny Lassig sat down with a cup of coffee in the Ruff's dining room across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. The investigation had been moving slowly so far because, for the first few days, everyone had been hoping that Brian would just return on his own. But as the days passed and he still hadn't been heard from, that was looking less and less likely. By this point, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, claiming to be his wife, Jennifer. And he had quickly found out that one of those calls was actually from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number, which meant very likely that was the real Jennifer Ruff. But Lassig was still trying to figure out why another woman had called and impersonated her, and also, the timing of the calls was odd. It happened one right after the other. It was just a very strange coincidence. So now, as Lassig sat across from the real Jennifer Ruff, he started out by asking her where she had been on the night Brian disappeared. She told him she had been at the hospital all night working, and then she gave Lassig names of some of her coworkers who could verify that. At this point, Lassig completely pivoted and just asked Jennifer point blank, "Is there any chance your husband could have been having an affair? Were there other women in his life? Was he acting secretive or just odd lately? Anything to indicate, that he was maybe unfaithful?" The reason Lassig asked, obviously, was because of the second woman who he knew had called and pretended to be Brian's wife. He had no idea if the real Jennifer knew, but certainly he did. And the real Jennifer, when she heard this question, she just sort of looked down and then she looked up and she said, "Yes, I am suspicious of that." She told Lassig that she and Brian had been having some real issues in their marriage lately, and in fact, just the previous month, Brian had sort of inexplicably, ran out on the family because he needed time alone, and he was gone and out of contact for that whole time until he just came back begging to be taken back. At this point, Lassig, when he heard that part, he sat back in his chair and wondered if he was just wasting his time on this case to begin with. Because if Brian had previously left and then eventually came back after being totally out of contact, well, what's to say he wasn't doing that right now? What if this was him again, sort of running off to be alone and he would just turn back up again at some point? But Jennifer must have noticed that that's sort of where Lassig's mind was going, because she rushed to add in that, the last time when he ran out for that week, he had left a note for her and even told his boss that he was quitting. There was some warning before he left. She sort of made it dramatic, but he definitely told people before he was going to be gone. In fact, she became insistent that really it was not like Brian to not give warning. For him to just vanish mid-shift like that, like he's done right now, that's not something Brian would do. He's got some faults, but that's not something he would do. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer where Brian had actually gone when he disappeared that first time. And Jennifer answered him by handing him a piece of mail from a nearby table. She explained that it was a credit card bill that had come in the mail that week, and it was addressed to Brian. And she explained that she was pretty confused when she got this because she didn't even know Brian had a credit card. But he apparently did, and he used it while he was away to pay for hotels and meals and other expenses. And so Lassig, he pulled out the bill and began to look it over, and he saw that a lot of the charges were made in Las Vegas and San Francisco. And the amounts that were being charged to restaurants and for room service seemed a bit too large for just one person. He looked up from the bill back at Jennifer, and just from the expression on her face, he knew that they had both drawn the same conclusion. Brian, when he was away for that week, likely had not been alone. Jennifer then grabbed another piece of paper from the counter and gave that to Lassig. This was a phone bill for the family's landline, with a full list of every call that had been made and received in the past month. Jennifer said there were definitely some numbers on this list that she didn't recognize, and she thought maybe one of them could be this person that Brian had been traveling with. And as Lassig looked over this list, one of the phone numbers immediately stood out to him, because that woman who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared and pretended to be Jennifer, basically called right after the real Jennifer, that phone number that was used for the fake Jennifer was the number he was now seeing on this list. Later that same day, Lassig sat down in the living room of the house that was associated with that phone number. And sitting across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kennecott mine where Brian worked. Now, at the moment, Dale wasn't home, but it wasn't really clear when he would get home, and Lassig was really anxious to interview Christy alone, so before her husband got back. So the instant they sat down, Lassig pretty much just cut to the chase. He told Christy that he was nearly positive she and Brian had been having an affair. And then before she could say anything, he pulled out that bill that Jennifer had given him and showed her all the evidence. Christy, when she saw this, for a second looked defiant, but then just broke down and admitted it was true. She said they'd been seeing each other for a while now, and in fact, the month before, they had run away together for about a week. But even though they had ultimately come back and they both went back to their respective families, she said that they had still been very much in touch. Christy said that was the reason she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, just to call and just be in touch with him. That was it. But she said when the person answered and it was a voice that was unfamiliar, it was Detective Lassig, she said that sort of on instinct, she just began to lie and pretended to be Jennifer, Brian's real wife, just so, their affair would not come to light. But Christy made it very clear that she had not heard from Brian since he disappeared, and she had no clue what happened to him. At this point, Lassig sat back on the couch and just looked at Christy, kind of sizing her up. And he thought, she seemed pretty genuinely worried about Brian. And even though the call she had made to the guard shack was ultimately very suspicious and pretty bizarre, her explanation for it did make sense. But at this point, he was certainly not going to rule her out as a suspect quite yet. Also, Lassig knew that Christy's husband, Dale, was also now clearly a primary suspect. Because, if he had found out about this affair, he could have easily hurt Brian in retaliation. The following day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station where Dale was already seated and waiting for him. And the moment Lassig walked in, Dale immediately asked him if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And it seemed to him like Dale's disappointment was genuine, like he was worried about him. Lassig sat down and he asked Dale about how long he'd known Brian for. And Dale said they had met maybe about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they'd become pretty close friends. They'd even hung out together outside of work. At this point, Lassig, almost to catch Dale off guard, he pivoted sort of abruptly and just asked Dale point blank about his wife's affair. And Dale, when he heard that his wife was having an affair, seemed sort of stunned, and he said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. At this point, Lassig just explained to him what his wife had already told him. And Dale appeared genuinely upset. Like, the idea she was cheating on him was horrible, especially with someone he considered clearly to be a close friend. And so as Dale is sort of reacting to this really shocking news, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. And so Dale, who again is sort of like dealing with the shocking news he's just been told, for a moment he just was unable to answer. He ultimately composed himself and he said that actually his car had gotten stuck in the snow while he was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, almost an hour away from the mine. And in fact, he had even had to call a friend to come get him out of the snow. And then he gave Lassig the name of this friend so he could call and confirm it. After taking down this friend's name, Lassig told Dale that he really wanted him to take a polygraph test, and also they would have to search his car. And Dale agreed to both, with no hesitation. One morning, a few weeks later, Lassig walked across a parking lot toward an office building at the Kennecott mine. So far, Brian had still not turned up, and the search for him had been frustrating because none of the people Lassig had questioned so far had given him any useful information. Dale Bradley, along with his wife, Christy Bradley, had both taken polygraph tests, and both had passed. Lassig had also searched the red Mustang that Dale drove, but there was no evidence in it that linked Dale to Brian's disappearance. Plus, the friend who had helped Dale get his Mustang out of the snow had confirmed he had done that, so his alibi was solid. So at this point, Dale and Christy were sort of unofficially off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the fact that maybe Jennifer, the real Jennifer, so Brian's actual wife, maybe she was involved in her husband's disappearance, despite how, honestly she came across. Now, her coworkers had confirmed she had been at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she could have maybe been working with an accomplice or maybe hired somebody to kill Brian or something. But with no evidence against her and also no body, Brian has not been found here, all Lassig really had here was just a hunch that, maybe she was involved, but who knows. However, just a few days ago, Lassig had received a new lead that sent his investigation in a new direction. That was why he was here right now at the Kennecott mine to speak to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows. So Lassig went inside the building and made his way down the hallway to Todd's office. And when Todd saw the detective, he jumped up and he very eagerly greeted him and said he would do whatever he had to do to try to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told Todd to sit back down. And then Lassig sat down as well, and then he pulled out a tape recorder and he hit record. And then he told Todd why he was there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metal and equipment from the mine and then selling it at pawn shops. In fact, the investigation had discovered that a whole ring of Kennecott employees were involved in these thefts. Todd sort of began to shift in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he was never involved in any of these thefts, and he said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he understood that, and that was not really why he was here. He said when he looked through the records of the investigation about these thefts, he'd found out that Brian had actually been the one who reported some of the thefts that were going on. So now Lassig wondered if maybe on the night of Brian's disappearance, he'd stopped one of his coworkers' vehicles and found stolen materials inside, and maybe they had killed him to keep him quiet. Todd sat back in his chair and looked sort of lost in thought for a moment, and then he admitted that, yeah, that could be possible. He then told Detective Lassig he could actually think of several places on the mine's property where maybe Brian's body was hidden by these, fellow employees if they did this. And then as an example, he suggested the gravel pile by the concentrator, which crushes the minerals and grinds them up. Todd explained that if Brian had been placed there, he would have very likely gotten sucked into the grinders and pulverized with all the other rocks. He'd basically be gone. Detective Lassig was surprised by how specific Todd was being. Todd had really come up with this theory very quickly. So, sensing that Todd might be a little suspicious here, he just let Todd keep going. And Todd did. He just kept spitting out all these theories about maybe what could have happened to Brian, including at one point he said maybe Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles where weeks worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen down and completely covered him up. And he said if that had happened, if Brian had been hidden in a place like that, he would already be buried under several tons of rock at this point, and the police would never find him. On July 10th, 1993, so a year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig drove through a barren desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of Kennecott Mine. There had been basically no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours scouring the mine with police dogs and helicopters, looking for any sign that Brian might have been killed or buried or hidden somewhere there. But so far, there was still no trace of Brian. Now, Lassig was confident that there had to have been foul play involved. But it was impossible to prove that when he didn't have a body or evidence that tied any of his suspects to the crime. For months, Lassig's team had looked into every single security guard at the Kennecott Mine, especially the ones who had been implicated in that theft ring, but they had ultimately verified that every guard on duty was at their post at the time Brian disappeared. And they'd collected alibis from everyone who was not scheduled to work that night. And so they had not been able to actually link any guards to Brian's disappearance, and that also included Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, who seemed, very eager to offer up these very specific theories. He too was not linked to Brian's disappearance. However, Todd was ultimately linked to that theft ring. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and Christy's husband, Dale, those two, they had alibis, they passed a lie detector test, and really had been ruled out much earlier on in the investigation, and nothing new had come up over the last year to change that, so they were still ruled out. And then as for Brian's wife, Jennifer, Lassig at one point thought maybe she was involved, maybe she had an accomplice or something. She certainly had the motive, to potentially harm her husband. Their marriage was on the rocks, he had clearly been having an affair and she was on to him. But she really had been at work at the time he disappeared, and there was no link from her to any potential accomplice, and so it went nowhere. She was ruled out too. So again, after more than a year, the case basically had gone cold. However, that particular morning, the investigation had been reinvigorated because a group of campers had called in and said they had found skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew this was obviously a long shot, but he was holding out hope that maybe it was Brian. So when he arrived at the location the campers had described, Lassig got out of his car and he walked a short distance across the barren ground to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer to the crime scene, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow grave. The skeleton was clothed in a dust-covered dark blue jacket, and when Lassig crouched down to get a better look, he saw that it was clearly a security guard's uniform. Lassig put on some gloves and then searched the pockets of this jacket, and his fingers immediately landed on a wallet. And when he pulled it out and he looked inside, he found ID cards and credit cards with the name Brian Ruff. Now, at this point, it seemed fairly apparent that the body had to belong to Brian, but because the body was so decomposed, they would have to examine Brian's dental records to definitively ID him, which would take some time. So, while the crime scene techs carefully loaded the remains into a van, Lassig stayed at the scene with the canine unit that was searching for any other evidence nearby. And sure enough, just a few feet away from where the body had been, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells lying in the dirt. It looked like Brian, very likely, had been shot 5 times and then buried in this shallow grave. Then, just a few yards away from the shells, a police dog began barking, and an officer called Lassig over to look at what the dog had found. He walked over, and the officer held up a black work boot, and there was a pretty obvious bullet hole through the leather. And so Lassig figured the boot must have belonged to Brian. But other than this boot and Brian's actual body, 18 months of heat and, wind and sand and snow and rain out in this desert had basically erased any other traces of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig at this point felt very confident that he knew both where Brian was ultimately killed and how he was killed, because of this severe lack of forensic evidence, he was worried that he might not actually be any closer to figuring out who killed Brian. 12 years later, on April 30th, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office got a call from the Sheriff's Department in the next county over. Since the beginning of the year, Detective Park had been working full-time on solving various cold cases. The detective on the line told him that he was investigating a recent homicide and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. specifically the murder of Brian Ruff. After speaking to this detective, Park hung up the phone and went right over to his filing cabinet and dug through until he found Brian's file. He sat down and began sorting through the decade-old papers, and he realized that there was a tiny piece of evidence the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized it was actually the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Brian Ruff on December 10th, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down a winding service road toward a very isolated part of Kennecott Mine. Up ahead, they saw a single light in the distance. It was coming from a small guard shack right next to a chain link gate. The killer pulled right up outside of the shack and parked their car and then got out. And then seconds later, Brian Ruff came out of the guard shack and waved hello. And the killer sort of waved back and walked over to Brian, and then as soon as they were close enough, the killer grabbed Brian, whipped him around, tied his hands behind his back, and then forced Brian, before he could do anything, into the back of the vehicle. At this point, the killer jumped into the driver's seat, did a U-turn, and sped out of the mine towards the desert. And as they were driving, the killer heard Brian screaming and kicking in the back, doing everything he could to try to escape. But the killer was unfazed. They stayed calm and just kept on driving for nearly an hour, all while Brian's acting crazy in back, until they eventually reached another very remote spot way out in the desert about 50 miles away. There, they pulled off the road and they stopped their vehicle right in this open, snow-covered patch of desert. They climbed out, they went to the back seat, and they opened the door up, and they grabbed Brian, who was still fighting and trying to escape, but he was pretty tired at this point, and the killer dragged Brian out. And as they dragged Brian out, Brian began pleading for mercy and promised that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone about this. But the killer just grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then forced him at gunpoint to dig his own grave. And then when Brian was done, the killer just raised their shotgun and shot Brian 5 times. And then after he was dead, they dropped his body into the grave he had literally dug himself. And then the killer got back into their vehicle, a red Mustang. But when the killer tried to leave, their vehicle, the Mustang, got stuck in the snow. And so they had to call a friend who did come out, who had no idea a murder has just been committed literally right over there. There's a body buried, right over there. They didn't know. They helped the killer get out of the snow, and off they drove. The killer was Dale Bradley, the co-worker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that he had been an hour away, his car was stuck in the snow on the night Brian disappeared, well, it was true. Except that wasn't an alibi. He was basically describing being at the crime scene and having another friend come and help him flee the crime scene. But the friend who absolutely said, yep, he was an hour away, I helped him get his car out of the snow, the friend had no idea. This is where a murder has just taken place. And so they told the truth. And Dale sort of acted like, yep, that's my alibi. And the police never checked. And so they didn't realize that that wasn't an alibi. It was basically a description of where the crime scene was. Additionally, Dale took a polygraph early on in the investigation, and he did pass it. So he really was dismissed as a suspect very early on. And so Dale and Christy had eventually gotten divorced, likely over the affair, and Dale had ultimately remarried. But when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered in 2005, the detective investigating that murder noticed that Dale had been sort of indirectly connected to now 2 people who had been murdered, Crystal and Brian. And he thought it was suspicious enough that he got in touch with Detective Park, the detective who was in charge of all these cold cases, and he told Park, hey, you ought to take a closer look at Dale in the Brian Ruff cold case murder. And so that prompted Detective Park to not just take a closer look at Dale, but really at the whole Brian Ruff case file. And when he did that, he noticed this really small piece of evidence that sort of went overlooked. And that piece of evidence was a tiny speck of red paint on the sole of that black work boot, which had been found near Brian's body out in the desert. And Park was eventually able to match that paint to the same paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was charged with Brian Ruff's murder on September 19th, 2005. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping and was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for Crystal, Dale's second wife who was murdered, her case remains unsolved.